Thank you.
All right, welcome to you all for our Thursday evening class. So when I'm taking a turn Thursday evening, we're going through Old Testament history. And we are going through the book of 1 Samuel and speaking about the history about David. The last time, some weeks ago, we looked at the story of David and Goliath. So that was in chapter 17, 1 Samuel 17. So this evening I want to look at chapters 18 through 20. So after David had killed Goliath, he presented himself once again to King Saul. King Saul's son Jonathan was there as well. Now, as we look at the story, we're going to see the difference between King Saul and Jonathan. We're going to hear about Jonathan's love for David and Saul's hatred for David. Well, let's first of all hear about Saul's hatred for David. So Saul's hatred for David started when they had returned home from the war against the Philistines. The Israelite army had won a great victory over the Philistines. David had killed Goliath, the Philistine hero. And the Israelite army had defeated the Philistine army. On their way home after the war, the Israelite women met them as the soldiers were coming back. And the women of Israel sang a song. You can read that in 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 through 9. Perhaps you could share that, Samila?
Sí.
do shimo la sa do si kho sa bo khu de le khwe do to a he do so da we he ke le amati te pa ple sha ta pho ne do da ma ta le po mu de pa he tho ge kli do u ta le israel la we pu khe le di to a ko tu go so lu o we do de do ta tu khu ta khu do si le lo do po mu de pa ne po ta phơ mình đó si we đã so lu ma ti li apua ko thor pha do so da we ne apua ka la de pha le do so lu a tha tho ke tho do ma lo do ta ko to ti ne e we la ame do si we da pa we le so da we le ka la de pha do pa we le ya le ko thor pha ni lo do o di la go the bo mu lo dollar mutini ne lele do sunya so lu kwa so da we la ame lo
So that was the song that the Israelite women were singing when King Saul and all his men returned from this great victory.
no ta we ne me da ta we le pwa israel po me te pa ta we da pele awe pwa timothy bo te pa so lu da timothy bo he ke we da le ta man pha do pu ni lo
And in the song, as we read, they said that Saul had killed his thousands, but that David had killed his 10,000s.
le ta we pu na we te pa ta we da di e no so so pa so lu no awe da ma ti we da apwa ga tho te pha no do me so da we ne no la ka la te pha mo
That made King Saul very angry and filled him with jealousy.
ta we ne no ma ta tho we da so lu do ma no pwe we da ta do pwe da do ta ke we da le ta tu to mo community tu sa ta sa ni lo
He was jealous with David, jealous of David, that the women praised him 10 times more, that the women praised David 10 times more than they praised Saul.
awe da no ke we da le awe atake we da le awe so da we ni no ake da le no pa pa me te pa ni no ta we si tho ptre all ani we da le awe da no apa ko ni te ka la nya mo
He was filled, King Saul was filled with anger and jealousy.
so pa so lu na pwe we da ta tho do pwe we da ta tu ke ta ka ni lo
And an evil spirit came upon King Saul.
lo ne ta ni he lo we da le so pa so lu lo
So the next day they were in King Saul's throne room.
le me awe le me se rat ni ne na we ter pa we da le awe so pa so lu no anopu
And as David did every day when he was in the throne room, he was playing his harp.
di so da we ma da ko mini de so no pe la we da le awe lo pe so a me nya le so pa so lu a lo ni no awe da no we di we da na mo
He was sitting opposite of King Saul. King Saul was sitting on his throne and he was holding his spear.
awe da sina we da le no so pa so lu a me nya le a lo pe so me nya ni no ba ne awe da di we da na ke klo no ba ne so pa so lu na we da awe hi tho we da kan ya a bo pu be mo
Saul was in a terrible, terrible mood.
ke we da so pa so lu ne o we da le ta tu ta to pa do pu ni lo
He was filled with anger and hatred for David.
awe da pwe we da do ta tho do ta tu ke ta ka le so da we pa ku ni lo
Suddenly he hurled his spear at David, wanting to kill him and pin him to the wall.
no le tu la na we da we da bo ni na le so da we o no e do ma ti we da le che ti kha we da le wo pa lo mo
A few days later, he did exactly the same thing.
le sa ta we la ki ni na ma ga do da di ni lo
And both times David jumped out of the way just in time.
no le ki do le ni na so da we da ge se da ma ni na khri tha ku we da no le ta se do tu ga la pu no ta po klu lo mo
So Saul was thinking, how can I kill David?
le ta ne ko ne so da so pa so lu si we da chok mo da le no yi ko ba ma thi we da so da wi di le
So he thought, okay, if I send him away to do to more battles, probably he will die. He will be killed.
no yi mis ka we da la we da ka ba le du ta le ta du plo ni na ba te la a we da ka thi we da le ta du plo mo
So he made David a commander of a large part of his army.
la we da du ke ta we da so da wi no la me we da thi ko pa do la we da thi me kla
And as a brave commander, he would lead the people, the soldiers, into battle.
dia me we da no a we thi ko pa do ga ko na we da ka we da a thi mi ti bo le ke le we da le ta du mo
So King Saul he was sure, he was positive that David would be killed in battle.
pene no so pa so lu na we da thi nya da lo ti le no me we da le a we re ka ne so da wi ne ka ba thi ko we da le ta du blo pu ni lo
But he wasn't. He was more and more successful, every day more and more successful in his battles.
Masana ke na we te thi we da le ta du blo ba me me ko ne na a we da ne a we du ta ne no man ta a tho we da ni lo
The Lord guarded and kept care of David and made sure that he would not be killed.
ka sa yua no a we da sko da so da we ba ne we da pa ko o pa pu pa ple o no le a we da le so da we thi tu ba thi we da ni lo
And as David won more and more victories, the people more and more loved David.
di so da we na we da man ne ko da ta du ta ya a tho ba ne no man ta a bla ne na po go me na ke ne e ba da so da we do man ni lo
So King Saul saw him as a great threat to his kingship.
ba ne so pa so lo ne we ti we da le so da we ne me we da ta ba yo ta lo plia lo la we da ta me we da so pa ni lo
Now, you remember that when Goliath was threatening the armies of Israel, that Saul had said, "Whoever kills Goliath, I will give my daughter to whoever kills Goliath."
ne ti no ta dia no pele so pa so lu si we da no pa de ga la no la me ma ti ku we da so ka li ya ni no a we ke hi we da la pho mu mo pa de ga la ge no la me ma ti we da a we so ka li ya ni
He had made that promise very publicly, so he had to keep it.
a we da ma we da ta o lo ni no le kum le me nya ku na we da ka ba hi ka we da ta lo we ni
So he told David that he would give him his daughter Michal to become his wife.
na we da te we da so da we la ki we da pho mu no no mi ka la ke tho we da la ma ni lo
So Saul said to David, "I will give you Michal, but first you have to kill 1,000 Philistines."
na we si we da le yiki na le pho mu no mi ka la ba sa na ka so go te ni no ka ba ma ti ku we da pwa ple sha ta pwa ga de tho
That would be the bride price. That would be the dowry.
ta we ne ke me we da te la mo po mu a le pwe no ke me we da na ka ba hi lo we da ta lu ta pwe mo le ke ne ba yi pho me ne
So King Saul told David that he had to kill 100 Philistine soldiers, and Saul thought, surely David will be killed.
no so lu si we da le sa da we ne na ka ba ma ti we da pwa ple sha ta pwa ga te ya lo ne we da we ka ba ma ti we da mo lo ne we da ki we da la pho me
But David was not killed. The Lord was guarding him.
Masatana kene na awe kane ne awe chumo dale awe sopa da we kiti we dale ami mati banyane masana kene te tiwe ba kasaywa pe o kasaywa shoni la
And he did not kill only 100 Philistine soldiers, but he killed 200.
awe da te mati we da le pwa plesha tapo tele aga te ya ba me me ko mati we da pa plesha tapo aga ki yani la
So after this, Saul had no choice but to give his daughter to David as a wife.
เลือดตาเววิลากินเนาะซอลูเนาะซาปาซอลูอัตาคุตโตเลนอดมีบาเนาะเวดากะบะฮิเวดาอภูมิเนาะมิกาลาซูซอดาวิเลกะมีเวดามานี่เนาะ
And yet, time after time, Saul tried to find a way to kill King David.
บาซาตนาคิดเนี่ยเนาะเอาไว้ตบล้อวีตบล้อเนาะซอปาซอลูเนาะคือเวดาเคลลากะมาติเวดาซอดาวิเนี่ยเนาะ
But as David won more and more victories, the people more and more fell in love with David.
เนาะบาซานาคิเนี่ยซอดาวิเนาะเวดามันเนกเวดาตามันเนบลอดปาบลอเนี่ยเนาะพอกอมิเนี่ยเนาะเวติปาเอบาดาซอดาวิโดมันเนี่ยเนาะ
Saul's jealousy and hatred for David just grew and grew.
ซอลูเนาะอัตตาทอตาเฮดอตาตุเกตากาลซอดาวิอาพอคนเนี่ยเนาะโดทอเวดาเนาะรูโดทอเวดารูเนี่ยเนาะ
And several more times, Saul, in a fit of rage, hurled his spear at David, intending to kill him.
เนาะเลเอาไว้สวาบล็อกดอนเนี่ยเนาะซอลูเนาะเวดาเนาะกุยเวดาบ่เนาะเลซอดาวิอาโอเดตอลาเวดากะมาเทียเนี่ยเนาะ
But every time David moved out of the way,
ภาษานักก็บล็อกเนี่ยเนาะแกเวดาเลซอดาวิเนาะเวดาติเลกุยาตันเนี่ยเนาะ
and the spear just thudded into the wall.
บล็อกเนี่ยแกเวดาเลเอาไว้บ่เนี่ยเนาะเสบาตาเลตาลูกปาโลล่ะ
The Lord was protecting David.
ก็ใส่ว่าดอตเดเวดาซอปาดาวิ
Why was the Lord so protective of David?
บามนึกคนละก็ใส่ว่าเนาะเวดาเปิดาดอตเดเวดาซอดาวินี่แหละ
Because God's plan was to bring Jesus Christ out from the line of David.
มีเลือกก็ใส่ว่าตาระดักเลเนี่ยเนาะเอาเวดาก็เฮสก็เวดาก็ใส่ชูครีเนาะเลือซอปาดาวิอัคลียตามอาเซอร์สเว
Right? We know that. We know the end of the story, that Jesus Christ is going to come forth from the line of David.
ปฏิญญาเวดาเนาะปฏิญญาเวดาเลือกคิดเนี่ยเนาะเอาไว้ก็ใส่ชูครีแค่เวดาแค่ทอเวดาเลือเอาไว้ซอปาดาวิอาเซอร์สเวมา
For that reason, God protected David.
เลือตาเกไว้ในคนเนี่ยเนาะก็ใส่ว่าดอตเดเวดาซอดาวิ
Now, as much as Saul hated King David, so much did Saul's son Jonathan love David.
ดีตัวดาซอปาซอลูเนาะตาเฮเวดาซอดาวิโดมาเนาะอตัวนี้เนาะไม่เมลาพวกซอยูนาตานี่เนาะเวดาซอดาวิโดมานี่เนาะ
That began right from after when David had killed Goliath and had presented himself to Saul.
เนาะมีเวดาเนาะตบล็อกก็เลยเวซอดาวินามาติกเวดาซอกาลิยาเวลกิเนาะเวดาให้ปะพลาทเวอัตเลซอปาซอลูเมียนี่
Saul took every opportunity to speak well of David to his father. No, sorry, let me start again. Jonathan took every opportunity that he could to speak well of David when he was speaking with his father Saul.
ซอยูนาตานะเวดาฮินี่เวดาตะควริยาบะก็ตอเดลาเวดาก็โตเวดาตาริตาวาบาคาดอซอปาดาซอดาเวรีเนาะลาปาโอมอเพตบลอลาลาลาเวดาเตระดาปาคานี่
The more Jonathan spoke well of David, the more jealous Saul became.
เนาะแกเวดาเลซอยูนาตาเวดาเตเวดาซอดาเวรีเนาะลาปตรเวดาอารีลารีกเลนี่เนาะเวดาเตเวดาดีอาลานาปานี่เนาะอัตตาโดทออัตตาเกตากานี่อาทอเวดา
His jealousy made him insane.
เอาเวดาตาตุเกตากานี่ยาเอาเวดาดิโอทอลาเมเวดาตาเลอลอบเลเมตาเล awe da kanine atu wood thole ba mo metale awe get agwe da le ha ga po ta pitama.
And because Jonathan spoke well of David, King Saul began to hate his son Jonathan.
Na mele so mele no so Jonathan we da to we da so da we hone no apane na we da start no ta he ko da we da apokwa so Jonathan.
And a number of times, Saul even tried to kill his son Jonathan.
No, to blue blah na awe so paso solo na we da go klese mati se ko da apokwa so Jonathan mo.
He hurled his spear at his son Jonathan.
Awe da kuye da ball apokwa so Jonathan wo.
But the Lord also protected Jonathan.
Pasana ke sa yu awe da dot de se ko da so Jonathan.
Now, why did Jonathan love Saul? Love David?
Bamne kolo so Jonathan ne e ba we da so da winile.
Well, Jonathan saw something special in David.
So Jonathan tiwe da no ta de mi lo so special so da we punilo.
He probably couldn't explain it, but he saw that God was doing something with David.
Awe batete la shep ya we da te basana ka tiwe da le no ka sa yu mata de mi le so da we pumo.
So Jonathan was a very godly man.
So Jonathan we da me da pale e we da ka sa yu do marganilo.
Jonathan and David made a covenant between themselves.
So Jonathan do so da we na we da do to we da ta lo le awe te pa bese.
They promised to be faithful to each other.
Awe te lo we da la ta to lo ta ga do ga.
And David promised that in the future, he would be faithful to Jonathan's family.
Awe da lo we da le kasumenya ne na awe da ko tu to ta to da so le so Jonathan do hipokopo a unilo.
So David promised Jonathan that after Jonathan died, David would be faithful to his children.
Le so so da we na we da lo we da le awe so Jonathan mithi we la kine na we da ka ta to we da do so Jonathan hipokopo a puthir panilo.
They both realized that David was going to become king.
Awe tirpaki ale ne tenya we da le no awe so da we no ka ke we da so panilo.
That God was going to replace King Saul with David.
Le ka sa yu no awe da ka pa tho ke we da awe so da we le so pa so lu alo.
Jonathan saw what the Lord was doing.
So Jonathan tiwe da ta le ka sa yu ma we ni lo.
And he was good with understanding what the Lord was doing.
Awe da no na pe da we do ma le ta le ka sa yu ma we ni lo.
Now, normally, Jonathan would become king after Saul.
Me me anor kane no ke we da le so Jonathan no awe da ka ba ke da so pa le pa so lu alo kini lo.
Everybody could expect that when Saul became old and died, that his son Jonathan would take his place. But Jonathan saw what God was doing. Jonathan saw that it was God's plan to give the kingship to David.
So Jonathan tiwe da le no ta we ni me da ka sa ya ta klela ke lo ke we da no bo mi le so da we su pu ni lo.
Time after time, Jonathan warned David about Saul's plans to kill him.
No to awe to blow ni no so Jonathan we da du blow we da so da we le we so lu ta klela ka ma fi ni lo.
Time after time, Jonathan saved David from Saul's murderous plots against him.
Now to blow by the blow na to blow with blow ni we so Jonathan da ma pu play we da so da we le so lu ata lu ma thi o na ta ku to palo akle aklutir pala Matthew ni lo.
At the end, Jonathan and David realized that they had to say farewell to each other.
No ne le ki tene no awe so Yunathan do so Dawi na awe tir patinya lo we da ta le no awe tir pa no ka ba lo palo ta ka ba komyane ka ba sege so wa lo ki ta le ki ten lo.
They both realized that David had to go away.
Awe ki ga le ne tinya we da le no so Dawi ka ba ha yi ku we da ni lo.
Sorry. So they had a final, Jonathan and David had a final meeting together, and they both wept.
No le ki tene no so Yunathan do so Dawi ki ga le no awe tir patilo ata to pu ko do na awe tir pa ki ga ne ho we da do mani lo.
They loved each other so greatly that when they realized they had to part ways, that they both were they just wept.
Na wetir pa kigalene na elo atado mano basana kya wetir pa kigalene tenya da la wetir pa kabale we da le kler gar bo mo hone wetir kigalene na ho we da do manilo.
Now, some people say that Jonathan and David had a homosexual relationship.
Banyato no ne te we da le wet kane so Yunathan da so da we kiane na wetir pa a ebgelo da mo do da.
That is absolutely not true at all.
Da we ne na te me da tamita tolir kilo.
They had a very godly relationship.
Awetir pa uwe da dota rilo batwele apwe da dota kasayani no.
Of course, it is possible for two men to love each other without it being a sexual relationship.
No, mewe da ta mata tile no, pa kiga no, pa kwa kiga no, elu athano, la ta pa kuwe da do, mukwata, komyane mukwa atarilo mulubani no.
In a very godly way, they loved each other, and when they went their separate ways, they both wept.
Le ta etu yuwa kle no, awetir pa kiga lene elu athadoma, do ne awetir pa lo balo pa do ne awetir pa kiga lene howe da domani no.
If you could please show 1 Samuel 20, verse 42.
No, te shumon la se do kisi sapol wisiki. Do so Yunathan si baso dawi le tamimuriki agedi e pesota kiga lole yua ami. Do si mo yua odo ya do na bese. Do le ye kliyetha do ne klinetha bese. Lo tulo yuriki. Do so dawi gesete. Do hawe. Do so Yunathan kikida kisuwe pulong.
So David and Jonathan, I should say, David and Jonathan said goodbye to each other, and they promised that they would always remain faithful to each other.
So Yunathan do so dawina awe tirpano awe no soge sowa lotha no awe lo palotha no basat nakini no awe tirpa kialeni lo olo lotha no la awe tirpa katato lotha tugado gani no.
And that this covenant relationship that they had with each other would also descend down into their descendants.
No ke daleta lo olo no ata rilo batwewe ine no awe kabata so kosi ko ono le awe da awe pala lo so tirpamo.
So they promised that they would make sure that their children and grandchildren, David's children and grandchildren, and Jonathan's children and grandchildren, would be faithful to each other.
Awe tirpa lo olo we dalu no so pa dawi a potirpa da litirpa do soyunata potirpa do litirpa wetirpa kasato luata kedegde da wenilo.
Now, the important thing that we see in this story is the separation between the line of separation between the children of God and the children of Satan.
No, petiwe da lut awe da lopalo tawe ine no awe da abese duwe nene no le awe yua apotirpa bese do awe mukoli apotirpa bese mo.
And we see that line of separation between the family of Satan and the family of God right there in Saul's family.
No, petiwe da lut da lopano le awe da bese pepe ni no le awe yua apole hipokopo do mukoli apo hipokopo ne mata no pepe ni no le sosolua hipokopo aklapeni.
King Saul was a child of Satan.
So pasa solo ni na miweda mukoli apo.
Jonathan was a child of God.
So Jonathan na weda miweda yu apo.
So right there in King Saul's family, you see the separation between the children of the devil and the children of God.
Pepe ni na ni tiweda na le so pasa solo hi poko po na aweda kane ta lo palo ta le ta besele na aweda kane ne yu apo tirpa do mukoli apo tirpa mo.
God was raising up David.
No kasa yu na weda aweda kane duga sete weda so dawi.
God was going to make David king. He was establishing the house of David, the royal house of King David.
No, kasaywa da kathulo weda awe no awe so da wi no abomu no awe da kanene keweda le solo sopa abomu le so da wi apu.
And we know that Jesus Christ came from the royal house of David.
Na butinya na le kasay shukri weda le sopa da wi asethwe.
Satan knew exactly what God was doing. That by saving David time and again, he was making a line all the way to the birth of Jesus Christ.
No, aweda pakko khaweda no pakhaweda no aweda kani klise tirpa le kase shukriya klise ke heweda ni lo.
Satan knew this, and he tried to fight against what he saw God was doing.
Awe mikoli tiweda tawe ne konya weda du thoda weda ta le kase yama weda ni lo.
And even to this day, Satan knows what God is doing.
No, mimisati ni daile ni no kase mikoli tinya weda le ta le kase yama weda ni lo.
But he still fights against what he sees God doing.
Pasana ke na weda ni no awe du thoda weda di dale ta le ati weda le kase yama weda ni lo.
Satan knows that he is going to lose, that God will win, and yet he continues to fight against God.
Na mikoli tinya weda le na weda kashuk weda da mikoli na weda kashuk weda bla ne na kasaywa ne na kanne weda ta na basatana ka weda guklese na du thoda weda kasaywa.
There's a warning there for us.
Ta hiplole bwetir pago.
Satan knows that he's going to lose, and yet he fights against God, and he tries to get more and more people to follow him.
Na mikoli tinya weda le na kasaywa ka maneta ko ne na aweda no uklese thoda weda du thoda da kasaiwa banene aweda kane uklese kweni lwenwe da pwa tirpala ko poda ki awone lo.
So from these chapters, from this lesson, we see, I would say, two main things.
No tamalowe na malowe da ta kim tamopa kimimo.
The first one is the victory of God over the devil. Right? The devil was using King Saul to try to kill David. But the devil was not successful. He failed in his attempt to get Saul to kill David. So in this story, we see the great victory of God. God preserved David, and as we read through the rest of the Old Testament, we see that God continued to preserve King David. God would establish David's royal house, and from that house would come forth Jesus. So that's the first thing we should notice. The great victory of God over Satan. But the second thing that we should learn from this lesson is that we really need to be careful. The devil is still powerful. The devil will have power until God throws him into the lake of sulfur. But in the meantime, before Jesus comes back, the devil still has power. He knows he is going to lose the battle. He's going to end up in the lake of burning sulfur, but he does whatever he can to try to get more and more people going into hell with him. So we need to be very careful. We need to read scripture, and we need to pray as families. We need to be members of a faithful church. We need to make sure that every Sunday again we are sitting under the faithful proclamation of the word. In that way, by scripture, prayer, faithful church attendance, we push back the threats of the devil against us.
nó lướt lên đi nè từ phản nó lướt ta phá đặc sai wa lướt ta nó ta ủa đã lướt tàu phụ lướt ta tụt ta to phụ nó ta năng ủa đã ta sẽ tới là cái sai wa lướt ta nó ao nè nó ủa đã mi ủa đã ta từ phá lên nó ao ủa đã cho thoát đã ủa đã mua cái liệt ta đưa ta lướt bùa nè nó.
All right, are there any questions?
Ta thấy có được mi á. Would you like to stop the recording?